The following story is a work of folklore-inspired horror. It contains suspenseful themes and supernatural imagery. Viewer discretion is advised for younger audiences or those sensitive to the paranormal. Deep in the heart of Maryland, where the Chesapeake mists roll over the rolling hills and the oak trees grow so thick they seem to swallow the sun, there lies a small, unnamed town that locals simply call the Hollow. It is a place where the cicadas hum a little louder than they should, and the shadows stay long even at high noon. This is where our story begins. Not with a scream, but with the quiet sound of a moving truck's tires crunching over gravel. Thomas and Clara Miller were looking for a fresh start. They were city people, tired of the relentless hum of electricity and the neon glare of the suburbs. They wanted a place where their 7-year-old son, Oliver, could run through the grass without hitting a fence. When they found the old Thorn farmhouse, a sprawling white timbered structure with a porch that wrapped around it like a protective arm, it felt like a dream. But the locals in the nearby general store didn't share their enthusiasm. When Thomas mentioned the property, the old men on the porch stopped rocking their chairs. They didn't say it was haunted. They just said the house was full. The first few days were spent in a whirlwind of cardboard boxes and bubble wrap. The house smelled of old cedar and dried lavender, a pleasant scent that masked the age of the wood. Oliver was delighted, claiming the turret room on the 3rd floor as his kingdom. Thomas and Clara, exhausted but happy, spent their evenings on the porch, watching the Maryland fireflies dance in the tall grass. It was peaceful. It was perfect, until the afternoon Clara decided to clear out the crawl space in the attic. Hidden behind a loose floorboard, tucked away as if it were a secret the house was trying to digest, was a wooden box. It wasn't ornate or jeweled. It was simple oak, stained dark with age, and tied shut with a single strand of coarse, gray twine. There was no label, no name, just a symbol burned into the lid. A small, hand-drawn lantern with a spider sitting inside it. Clara felt a strange chill as she touched it, a prickle of static electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. She brought the box down to the kitchen table, where Thomas and Oliver were eating sandwiches. The curiosity was infectious. Thomas untied the twine, which felt surprisingly strong, almost like wire. Inside, they didn't find jewelry or money. They found a set of 6 hand-carved wooden figurines, a small iron bell, and a piece of parchment that looked like it had been soaked in tea. The parchment was a map of their own house, but drawn with strange additions: doors where there were only walls, and a path of dots leading into the woods. At the top of the parchment, in elegant, faded calligraphy, were the words, "The Weaver's Path," a game for those who wish to see. Play once to find what is lost. Play twice to lose what is found. Underneath were the instructions, written as a poem. It spoke of placing the figurines in specific corners of the house and ringing the bell at the stroke of dusk. It seemed like a harmless piece of local folk magic, the kind of thing bored children might have invented 100 years ago to pass the time during a long winter. Oliver's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement only a child can muster. He begged his parents to play. Thomas, a man who prided himself on his logic and love for history, laughed. He thought it would be a wonderful way to connect with the heritage of their new home. Clara was more hesitant. There was something about the way the wooden figurines felt, warm to the touch, as if they had a pulse, that made her heart heavy. But seeing the joy on her son's face, she eventually relented. "It's just a game, Clara," Thomas said, ruffling Oliver's hair. "A bit of Maryland history. We'll do the first round, and if it's boring, we'll put it back in the box. It'll be a story to tell the neighbors." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Maryland sky in bruises of purple and gold, the Millers followed the first instruction. They placed the first figurine, a small wooden bird, on the mantel of the fireplace. The second, a wooden fish, was placed by the kitchen sink. Each placement felt strangely significant, as if they were anchoring the house to something heavy and deep. The air in the house began to change. The humidity of the afternoon was replaced by a crisp, dry stillness. When the clock on the wall ticked toward 8 p.m., the official start of dusk, Thomas picked up the small iron bell. The instructions said that once the bell was rung, no one could leave the house until the first thread was found. They didn't know what a thread was, but they assumed it was a hidden prize or a part of the game's lore. With a playful wink at his family, Thomas swung his hand. The sound of the bell was not the sharp ting they expected. It was a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into their very bones. It didn't fade away. It echoed, bouncing off the walls and growing louder, until it felt like the house itself was humming in harmony. Outside, the cicadas suddenly went silent. The fireflies vanished. The world outside the windows became a wall of absolute, impenetrable black. They stood in the kitchen, frozen by the sudden shift in atmosphere. The light in the room seemed to dim, though the bulbs didn't flicker. It was as if the shadows in the corners were growing longer, reaching out toward the center of the table. Oliver reached for Clara's hand, his excitement replaced by a wide-eyed wonder that bordered on fear. Then, from the hallway upstairs, the hallway leading to the attic, they heard it. Knock! 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 It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound. Not the sound of a house settling, but the sound of knuckles on wood. It was coming from the inside of the walls. Thomas looked at the map on the table. A small, wet spot had appeared on the parchment, right over the room where they stood. The game had begun, and the first rule of the Weaver's Path was now clear. Once you invite the guest in, you must finish the walk. Thomas tried to keep his voice steady for Oliver's sake. Just the wood expanding, guys. Come on, let's go see what that was. But as he moved toward the hallway, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The wooden bird they had placed on the mantel was no longer there. In its place was a single, long silver thread, shimmering in the dim light like a trail left by a very large, very patient spider. The Millers didn't know it yet, but they had just crossed a threshold that hadn't been opened in over a century. The quiet family of 1924 had started exactly where they were, and they too had thought it was just a game. The woods were watching, the house was breathing, and the weaver was beginning to spin. We must respect the traditions and boundaries left by those who came before us. Curiosity is a gift, but when it leads us to disturb the rest of the past, we must be prepared for the past to wake up. The silver thread did not look like silk. It looked like liquid moonlight captured in a strand, humming with a faint, electrical pulse that seemed to vibrate the air around it. Thomas reached out a finger to touch it, his hand trembling just slightly. As his skin brushed the cool, metallic surface of the thread, a spark jumped to his fingertip. It wasn't a painful shock, but a sudden, jarring memory of a childhood song he hadn't thought of in 30 years. It was as if the thread wasn't just material, but a conductor for things long forgotten. "Thomas, don't," Clara whispered, her voice tight with an instinct she couldn't quite name. She pulled Oliver closer to her side. The kitchen, which had felt like the heart of their new home just an hour ago, now felt like a stage set, familiar, yet somehow artificial. The windows were no longer portals to the Maryland woods. They were black mirrors reflecting their own anxious faces. The silence from outside was absolute. No crickets, no rustle of wine through the oaks. Just the heavy, expectant weight of the house. Thomas pulled his hand back, rubbing his thumb against the scorched sensation on his finger. It's just a reaction, Clara. Static. The air is dry." He tried to project a confidence he didn't feel. He looked down at the parchment map on the table. The wet spot had grown, and now a thin, shimmering line on the paper connected the kitchen to the cellar door. The map was updating itself in real time, reacting to the game they had inadvertently fully committed to by ringing the bell. "The bird is gone," Oliver said, his small voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. He pointed to the mantel where the wooden figurine had sat. "The bird turned into the string. Does that mean the fish will turn into a string too?" His innocence was the only thing keeping the atmosphere from collapsing into pure dread. To a child, a transformation was a wonder. To an adult, it was a violation of the laws of the world. As if in response to Oliver's question, a loud, hollow thump echoed from beneath their feet. It was followed by a rhythmic scraping sound, like a heavy loom being dragged across stone. Thump shhh, thump shhh. The sound was coming from the cellar. Thomas grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the beam cutting through the dimness of the hallway. He felt a responsibility to prove that there was a logical explanation, that the Maryland soil beneath them wasn't stirring with something ancient. They moved as a unit toward the cellar door. The wood was cold, unnaturally so for a humid Maryland summer night. When Thomas pulled the door open, the air that rushed up was scented with damp earth and something sweet, like rotting peaches. The silver thread from the mantel didn't just end. It stretched out, floating in midair, leading directly down into the darkness of the basement. It didn't sag under its own weight. It hung perfectly straight, a guide wire into the unknown. "We don't have to do this," Clara said, her hand gripping the doorframe. "We can just leave. We can go to a hotel in town and come back in the morning when the sun is up." But as she spoke, she looked toward the front door. The silver thread had already begun to weave itself across the exit, a delicate but unbreakable web of shimmering light. The house was sealing itself. The game wasn't something they were playing. It was something that was now playing them. Thomas led the way down the narrow wooden stairs, the flashlight beam dancing over jars of old preserves and discarded gardening tools. In the corner of the cellar, near the old coal chute, the second figurine, the wooden fish, sat on a crate. As they watched, the wood of the fish began to soften. It didn't melt. It unraveled. Fine, silver fibers peeled away from the carving, spinning themselves into the air, joining the first thread to create a thicker, glowing cord. Thump shhh, thump shhh. The sound was louder now. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the very center of the room. In the patch of light from Thomas's flashlight, they saw it. A shadow that didn't belong to any object in the room. It was long and spindly, with many limbs that moved in a slow, weaving motion against the back wall. But when Thomas swung the light directly at the source, there was nothing there, only the silver threads, vibrating with that low, haunting hum. "Look," Oliver whispered, pointing to the floor. The threads weren't just hanging in the air. They were beginning to trace patterns on the ground. They were forming words or perhaps a map. Thomas leaned in, his heart hammering against his ribs. The threads were spelling out a name, but it wasn't a name he recognized. It was a date, 1924. The year the previous family had vanished. Below the date, the threads coiled into a single, terrifying command: follow the pattern. Clara felt a wave of coldness wash over her. "Thomas, this isn't a game. It's a trap. We're being led somewhere." She looked at the silver cord, which now stretched from the cellar, back up the stairs and toward the second floor, toward Oliver's room. The realization hit them both at once. The game wasn't interested in the adults. It was moving toward the heart of the house, toward the child who had been the most eager to play. They hurried back up the stairs, the rhythmic knocking now following them, pacing them from behind the drywall. "Knock! Knock! Knock!" It sounded like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. Every time they passed a mirror or a window, they caught a glimpse of the silver threads reflecting in the glass, but when they turned to look directly at them, the threads seemed to disappear, leaving only the faint, ghostly hum in their ears. When they reached the second-floor landing, they found the third figurine, a wooden lantern, waiting for them on a small side table. It was already beginning to glow with a pale, sickly light. The air in the hallway grew thick, making it hard to breathe, as if the oxygen was being replaced by the very silk the weaver was spinning. They were being hemmed in, directed toward a specific path that led higher and higher into the old farmhouse. Thomas reached for the lantern figurine, hoping to stop the process, but the moment his fingers closed around it, the light flared into a blinding brilliance. For a split second, the hallway transformed. The modern wallpaper peeled away, replaced by dark, heavy Victorian drapes. The electric lights vanished, replaced by the flickering glow of candles. They saw, for the briefest moment, a woman standing at the end of the hall. She wore a dress of gray lace, and her fingers were moving rapidly, as if she were knitting the very air itself. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vision vanished. The hallway was back to its normal, slightly dilapidated state. But the lantern figurine was gone, and a third silver thread was now anchored to the ceiling, pulling taut. The house felt smaller now, the walls leaning in, the ceiling lowering. The game was progressing, and the threads were becoming a cage. They retreated into the master bedroom, locking the door behind them, though they knew a physical lock meant nothing to the force they had awakened. Thomas sat Oliver down on the bed, his hands shaking as he checked the map one more time. The path was now a circle, looping around the entire house, and they were right in the center of it. "We have to be careful," Thomas said, his voice a low rasp. "Whatever we do next, we do it together. We don't wander off. We don't follow the sounds. We stay in the light." He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he saw a reflection of the same ancient fear that must have gripped the families of Maryland's past. They had been too curious, too eager to touch the mystery, and now the mystery was touching them back. Outside the bedroom door, the knocking stopped. In its place came a new sound, the sound of 1,000 tiny, needle-like feet scurrying across the hardwood floor. The weaver was no longer just a shadow on the wall. It was coming to check the progress of its web. Curiosity is a powerful tool, but it must always be tempered with caution. Not every door that is locked was meant to be opened, and not every secret of the past is a gift. Sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is walk away from a mystery you don't understand. Morning in Maryland usually arrives with a heavy, golden heat that clings to the skin like a damp blanket. The air is typically thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant, briny tang of the Chesapeake Bay. But as the sun rose over the Thorne farmhouse the next day, the heat had vanished. In its place was a sharp, biting chill that felt more like a late November frost than a July dawn. Thomas woke to find his breath misting in the air of the bedroom. Beside him, Clara was already awake, her eyes fixed on the window. The glass was covered in a delicate, intricate pattern of frost that looked less like ice and more like a lace doily. The silver threads from the night before hadn't disappeared with the light. Instead, they had multiplied. They were no longer just single strands. They were beginning to form clusters in the corners of the ceiling, hanging down like the weeping branches of a willow tree. Thomas walked to the window and tried to scrape the frost away, but his fingernails didn't leave a mark. The ice was on the inside of the glass, and it felt as hard as diamond. When he looked out into the yard, the sight chilled him more than the air. The vibrant green of the Maryland woods had turned a dull, ashen gray. The trees looked skeletal, their leaves hanging limp and colorless. Downstairs, the house was silent. A heavy, pressurized silence that made their ears pop. They found Oliver in the kitchen, sitting perfectly still at the table. He wasn't eating the cereal Clara had set out for him. Instead, he was staring out the back screen door toward the dense treeline where the oak and pine grew thickest. His expression wasn't one of fear, but of intense concentration, as if he were listening to a frequency his parents couldn't hear. "Oliver? Hey, buddy, you okay?" Thomas asked, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Oliver didn't flinch, but he didn't look away from the woods either. He simply pointed a small, pale finger toward a cluster of shadows beneath a massive, ancient oak tree. "Nellie says the pattern is almost finished," Oliver whispered. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual childhood spark. "She says the weaver is sorry about the cold, but the threads have to be chilled to stay strong. She says we shouldn't try to leave anymore. It makes the weaver drop her stitches, and that makes her angry." Clara felt a jolt of alarm. "Who is Nellie, Oliver? Is she a friend from school?" She knew the answer before he spoke. They had only been in the house for a week. Oliver hadn't met anyone yet. "She's the girl in the gray dress," Oliver replied simply. "She lives in the spaces between the walls. She says she was the one who hid the box for us to find. She wanted someone to play with. She's been lonely since 1924. The mention of the date sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. It was the same date the threads had spelled out in the cellar. He realized then that the game wasn't just a haunting. It was a bridge. Something had happened in this house a century ago. A family had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a wooden box and a legend that the townspeople were too afraid to repeat. Now, that same history was trying to graft itself onto his own family. Thomas decided they couldn't stay a moment longer. "Get your coats," he commanded, his voice brooking no argument. "We're going to the car. We're driving until we see a police station or a church or anything that isn't this house." He grabbed the car keys from the hook by the door, but as he reached for the handle, he saw that the silver threads had woven a dense, shimmering screen across the entire doorway. It looked like a screen door made of diamonds, but when he pushed against it, it was as solid as a steel wall. He tried the back door, the windows in the living room, even the small pantry window, all of them were the same. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a cocoon. They were trapped inside a masterpiece of supernatural architecture, and the weaver was still working. Clara began to panic, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She started to beat against the silver webbing, but the threads didn't break. They only hummed, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to mock her efforts. "Stop it, Clara. You're hurting her," Oliver cried out suddenly. He ran to the center of the room, looking up at the ceiling. "Nellie says the weaver is trying to protect us. She says the thing in the woods is coming, and the web is the only thing that can keep it out." Thomas froze. "What thing in the woods, Oliver?" Oliver turned to look at his father, and for a second, his eyes seemed to flicker with an older, much sadder light. "The shadow that doesn't have a shape. The one that took Nellie's father. It follows the game, Dad. It follows the bell. When we rang the bell, we didn't just invite the weaver. We invited the hunter, too." As if on cue, a sound drifted in from the gray, frozen woods outside. It wasn't a knock this time. It was a long, low howl that sounded like the wind, but it had a rhythmic, vocal quality to it. It was the sound of something hungry, something that had been waiting for a century for the game to begin again. The shadows in the yard seemed to detach themselves from the trees, creeping toward the house across the frost-covered grass. Thomas looked at his son and then at the silver threads. He realized that the game had two sides. The weaver was spinning a cage, yes, but perhaps it was also a fortress. The moral weight of their situation pressed down on him. He had ignored the warnings of the townspeople, and he had ignored the strange friend his son had mentioned, dismissing it as a child's imagination. Now, he realized that in this world of folklore and shadows, the children were the only ones who truly saw the truth. "Oliver," Thomas said, kneeling down so he was at eye level with his son. "Tell Nellie we're sorry. Tell her we're listening now. Ask her what we need to do to keep the hunter out." Oliver nodded solemnly and closed his eyes. The room grew even colder, the frost on the windows thickening until they couldn't see the yard at all. The only light came from the silver threads, which were now glowing with a fierce, protective violet hue. The house groaned, the timbers complaining under the weight of the supernatural frost. They were no longer a family in a Maryland farmhouse. They were pieces on a board, caught in a struggle between an ancient protector and a nameless predator. We must never dismiss the words of a child when they speak of things we cannot see. Children are often more in tune with the rhythms of the world than adults, and their imaginary friends may be the only ones holding the key to our safety. To listen is to respect the wisdom of the innocent. There is a specific kind of fear that comes not from the unknown, but from the realization that you have stepped onto a path with no exit. In the frozen quiet of the Thorne farmhouse, the Miller family sat huddled in the center of the living room, surrounded by a shimmering cage of silver silk. The cold was no longer just a temperature. It felt like a living thing, a heavy weight pressing against their lungs. Thomas knew that if they stayed passive, the house would eventually consume them, or the hunter scratching at the frosted windows would find a way through the weaver's web. Thomas remembered the wooden box he had found in the attic. In his haste to bring the figurines downstairs, he hadn't checked the velvet lining of the box thoroughly. Leaving Clara and Oliver within the circle of a glowing rug, he dashed back to the kitchen, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards which now felt hollow, as if the house were losing its density. He found the box on the kitchen counter, its oak surface now covered in a fine layer of rime. He pried at the bottom with a butter knife, and with a sharp crack, a false bottom popped up, revealing a stack of yellowed, brittle papers and a small, rusted iron key. The papers were not just instructions. They were a ledger, a record of the Thorne family from 100 years ago. The handwriting was cramped and frantic, the ink fading into the parchment. As Thomas read by the flickering light of his flashlight, the true nature of the game began to emerge. It wasn't a game at all. It was a ritual of containment. The Weaver was a title given to the protector of the house, a spirit bound to the land to keep the Hollow Man, the hunter of the Maryland woods, from crossing the threshold into our world. "Clara, listen to this," Thomas called out, his voice cracking. He ran back to the living room, clutching the papers. "It says the game has rules that must never be bent. The bell must be rung only when the shadows are equal. The Weaver must be fed a memory to strengthen the thread. And most importantly, no iron must touch the web." Thomas looked down at the butter knife he had used to pry the box, and then at the iron bell he had rung so enthusiastically the night before. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had rung the iron bell at dusk, the time when shadows are longest and most unequal. By doing so, he hadn't just invited the Weaver to protect them. He had insulted the ritual. He had introduced iron, the bane of folklore spirits, into the very heart of the game. The silver threads weren't just protecting them. They were reacting to the poison of the iron bell. The Weaver was struggling because the Millers had broken the primary law of the house. As if the house were responding to his realization, the rhythmic knocking returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the floor directly beneath Clara's feet. Thud, thud, thud. The silver threads above them began to turn a sickly, bruised purple. The protective hum shifted into a low, mournful wail. Outside, The hunter let out a sound that wasn't a howl, but a laugh, a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves scraping against a tombstone. "We broke it, didn't we?" Clara asked, her eyes wide as she watched the violet tint spread through the room. "The game. We played it wrong." She looked at Oliver, who was staring at the air in front of him. Oliver reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against a strand of silk that was now vibrating violently. "Nellie says the weaver is crying," Oliver whispered. "She says the iron bit her. She can't hold the door much longer. The hunter is putting his fingers in the gaps." As Oliver spoke, they all looked toward the front door. The silver webbing was thinning. Through the gaps, they could see a pale, elongated hand pressing against the glass of the door's transom. The fingers were too long, with too many joints, and the skin looked like wet parchment. Thomas knew he had to fix the insult. The ledger mentioned that to heal a broken thread, the one who broke it must offer a truth of the heart. It was a classic folkloric exchange, knowledge and honesty for safety. He had to admit his arrogance. He had moved his family to this rural Maryland isolation because he wanted to be the provider, the pioneer, ignoring the history of the land and the concerns of his wife. He had treated their heritage as a toy, a curiosity for a YouTube story or a cocktail party anecdote. "I'm sorry," Thomas shouted, his voice echoing through the freezing house. He wasn't talking to Clara or Oliver. He was talking to the house itself. "I didn't respect the path. I brought the iron. I didn't listen to the woods." He grabbed the iron bell from the table and threw it toward the fireplace. As the bell struck the stone hearth, it shattered, not like metal, but like glass. The sound of the shatter was followed by a sudden, jarring silence. The violet hue in the silver threads began to recede, turning back to a brilliant, blinding white. The weaver's hum returned to its steady, protective frequency. The elongated hand at the window jerked back as if burned. For a moment, the family breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had corrected the error. They had acknowledged the weight of the knowledge they now possessed. But the ledger had one more page, one that Thomas hadn't read yet. He turned the brittle paper over. The last entry was dated October 14th, 1924. It read, "The hunter does not leave because the rule is fixed. He leaves only when the game is won. To win, the family must walk the path into the woods and find the weaver's heart. If they stay in the house, they are merely waiting for the silk to rot." Thomas looked at the door. The silver threads were no longer a wall. They were beginning to part, forming a literal path of glowing silk that led out of the house and into the dark, frozen forest. The suspense in the room was palpable. They were safe for the moment, but the game had shifted. It was no longer about hunker-down survival. It was a quest. To truly vanish from the hunter's sight, they had to follow the path into the heart of the Maryland wilderness, into the very place they had been trying to avoid. The house was letting them go, but it was also pushing them out. Thomas looked at Clara and Oliver. They were a family of three caught in a century-old web. He realized that knowledge was indeed a burden. He now knew exactly how much danger they were in, and he knew that the only way out was through the dark. He reached for Clara's hand, and then Oliver's. The front door creaked open of its own accord, the silver path stretching out like a ribbon of light across the gray, dead grass. "We have to go," Thomas said firmly. "We have to finish the walk." The cold from the outside rushed in, but it didn't feel as hostile as before. Felt like a challenge. The moral was clear. They had to face the consequences of their curiosity with bravery and unity. They couldn't hide behind the walls anymore. Knowledge is a heavy burden that must be carried with a brave heart. Once you understand the truth of a situation, you can no longer hide in the safety of ignorance. Responsibility means facing the path ahead, even when it leads into the darkest parts of the woods. There is a moment between the decision and the act where the world seems to hold its breath, a thin slice of time where the past and future collide. As the Millers stood on the threshold of their front door, looking out at the silver path that snaked into the Maryland woods, the house behind them groaned. It wasn't the groan of old wood or settling foundations. It was a wet, tearing sound, like a heavy tapestry being ripped down the middle. Thomas felt the floorboards beneath his boots tilt. The air, which had been freezing, suddenly became thick and cloying, smelling of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of the silver threads. They turned back, and the sight that met them was impossible. The kitchen, the room where they had shared their first meal in this house, the room where the game had truly begun, was no longer there. In its place was a void of swirling, gray mist and a dense, pulsating wall of cobwebs. These weren't the delicate webs of a common spider. They were thick, rope-like cables of silk that seemed to be knitting the air itself into a solid mass. The table, the chairs, and the map they had left behind were being swallowed, pulled into the walls by invisible needles. The heart of their home was vanishing, reclaimed by the weaver to fuel the path ahead. "The house is eating itself," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched Oliver so tightly her knuckles turned white. The panic was a physical presence now, a cold hand tightening around their throats. For a moment, the unity they had found in the previous hour threatened to shatter. Thomas wanted to run back into the disappearing room to save the ledger, to save the memories they had already started to build, while Clara's every instinct was to leap off the porch and into the freezing darkness of the woods. The conflict was a silent scream between them, a wedge driven by the weaver's design. "We have to move now," Thomas shouted, grabbing Clara's arm as the hallway began to buckle. The silver threads were no longer just glowing. They were vibrating with such intensity that the sound became a high-pitched whistle, a siren song of the supernatural. The ceiling above them started to descend, draped in heavy sheets of that bruised purple silk. The house was no longer a fortress. It was a trap that had finished its purpose. It had held them long enough for the game to take root, and now it was casting them out like seeds into the wind. They scrambled onto the wraparound porch just as the front door was sealed shut by a sudden, violent eruption of webbing. The wood of the house seemed to liquefy, the white timbers turning into gray, fibrous strands that braided themselves together. Within seconds, the farmhouse looked less like a building and more like a massive, calcified cocoon. There was no going back inside. The quiet Maryland family was now truly homeless, standing on a narrow wooden island surrounded by a sea of frost and shadow. "Dad, look," Oliver said, pointing toward the treeline. The hunter was no longer just a shadow. Through the mist, they could see a figure standing at the edge of the silver path. It was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs like charred branches. It didn't have a face, only a smooth, pale surface that reflected the moonlight. It didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting. It was the gatekeeper of the next act, the predator that knew the prey had nowhere else to go. The tension between Thomas and Clara reached a breaking point. "This is your fault," Clara cried, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Your fresh start, your game. We should have never come here." The words hung in the freezing air, more damaging than the cold. In the face of supernatural terror, the human spirit often seeks someone to blame, a way to make sense of the senseless. But as soon as the words were spoken, the silver path beneath their feet began to dim. The light of the weaver thrived on the bond of the players, and as that bond frayed, the protection faded. Thomas looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and realization. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "You're right," he said softly. "I brought us here, but I'm not letting us stay here. We are the Miller family, Clara. Not the Thorns. We don't vanish. We walk." He looked at Oliver, who was watching them with wide, fearful eyes. "Together. We do this together, or the light goes out." Clara took a deep breath, the anger dissolving into a grim, determined resolve. She squeezed Thomas's hand back. The silver path responded instantly, the glow returning with a brilliant, golden warmth that pushed back the gray mist. The lesson was becoming clear. The Weaver's game wasn't just a test of bravery or curiosity. It was a test of the heart. The vanishing room was a metaphor for their old lives. The kitchen, the comfort, the safety, it was all gone. All they had left was each other, and in this Maryland wilderness that had to be enough. They stepped off the porch and onto the path. The moment their feet touched the silver silk, the ground beneath them felt solid, even though it was draped over the uneven, frozen soil of the woods. The hunter at the treeline let out a low, frustrated hiss, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and retreated back into the deeper shadows. Couldn't touch them as long as they stayed on the path, and as long as they stayed together. As they walked deeper into the forest, the familiar oaks and maples of Maryland began to transform. The bark of the trees took on the texture of woven cloth, and the leaves above them turned into delicate lace. They were entering the weaver's realm, a place where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural had been completely erased. The silence of the woods was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thump shhh of the invisible loom that seemed to be working somewhere deep in the earth. The path led them toward a clearing where an ancient, gnarled willow tree stood. Its branches were draped not with leaves, but with thousands of silver threads, each one holding a small, glowing object, a key, a ring, a lock of hair. This was the graveyard of memories, the place where the weaver stored the truths of those who had played the game before. And there, sitting at the base of the tree, was the girl in the gray dress, Nellie. She was holding a wooden shuttle, her fingers moving with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. "You've lost your home," Nellie said, her voice echoing in their minds rather than their ears. "But you've found your strength. That is the only way to survive the hunter. But be warned, the path is long, and the weaver requires one more sacrifice before the sun is allowed to rise. You must choose what you are willing to leave behind forever." The suspense returned with a vengeance. They had survived the vanishing of their house, but now they had to face the vanishing of a part of themselves. The Maryland woods watched with 1,000 invisible eyes, waiting to see if the Millers were truly as united as they claimed to be. Unity is the only shield that cannot be broken by the darkness. When the world around us vanishes and our comforts are stripped away, the bonds we share with our loved ones are the only things that remain real. To turn against each other is to let the light go out. To hold on is to find the way home. The air beneath the weeping willow didn't just feel cold. It felt old. It was a thickness that tasted of iron and ancient rain, an atmosphere that seemed to vibrate with the voices of 1,000 people who had once walked these Maryland hills, but were now nothing more than whispers in the soil. Nellie, the girl in the gray lace dress, sat perfectly still, her wooden shuttle moving through the air as if she were knitting the fog itself. Around her, the glowing silver threads hung like the strings of a giant, silent harp. "You want to know where they went?" Nellie said, not looking up from her work. Her voice was like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a porch. "You want to know if they are still here in the spaces between the trees. Every family that plays the game leaves a shadow behind. Some shadows are just darker than others." She reached out and plucked a single vibrating thread. As she did, the Maryland woods around them began to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. Suddenly, the gray, frozen forest of 2026 flickered and dissolved. Thomas, Clara, and Oliver were still standing in the clearing, but the world had shifted its skin. The skeletal, frost-covered oaks were replaced by lush, vibrant summer greenery, but the sun was a pale, sickly yellow. Standing near the base of the willow tree was another family. They were dressed in the heavy wools and linens of the 1920s. A tall man with a stern face, a woman clutching a shawl, and a small boy who looked remarkably like Oliver. "The Sterling family," Nellie whispered, though she was now just a translucent shimmer in the background of this living memory. "They were the last ones to make it this far. Look closely. This is where the thread usually breaks." The Millers watched, frozen in place, as the ghosts of 1924 enacted their final moments. The father of the Sterling family was pacing, his eyes wild with a mixture of greed and terror. He held a silver figurine in his hand, the same wooden carvings the Millers had found, but these were still whole and unspun. In the vision, the Maryland woods were closing in. The hunter, the hollow man, wasn't just a shadow here. He was a towering presence of jagged edges and void, looming over the Sterlings. The father, desperate to save himself, tried to bargain. He offered the weaver a sacrifice, but it wasn't a memory or a truth. He tried to offer the weaver his wife's wedding ring, a symbol of a promise he no longer intended to keep. He thought the game was a transaction, a way to buy his way out of the darkness. As the Millers watched, the silver threads around the Sterling family turned a violent, jagged red. The weaver didn't want gold or silver. She wanted the sincerity of the heart. Because the father tried to cheat the game, the silver path beneath them shattered like glass. The hollow man didn't pounce. He simply stepped forward and merged with the father's shadow, pulling him, and the rest of his family, down into the very earth. They didn't scream. They simply faded into the gray mist, becoming part of the quiet that had haunted the farmhouse for a century. The vision snapped shut. The Millers were back in the freezing, silent woods of the present. The lesson was staggering in its clarity. The Sterling family hadn't vanished because of a monster. They had vanished because they lost their integrity. They had tried to outsmart the folklore, to treat a sacred ritual as a business deal. The quiet Maryland family of 1924 had become a legend because they had forgotten that in the world of the weaver, the only currency that matters is the truth of one's soul. "They are still here," Oliver whispered, pointing to the silver threads hanging from the willow. "They're the knots in the string." "Nellie, are we going to be knots too?" The boy's question hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. The silver threads around them were beginning to pulse with a low, rhythmic thud, the heartbeat of the weaver. The time for the final sacrifice was approaching, and the Millers knew they couldn't offer jewelry or empty promises. Thomas looked at Clara. He saw the reflection of the 1924 mother's fear in her eyes, but he also saw something the Sterlings didn't have: a stubborn, unyielding love that wasn't looking for an easy exit. "We aren't like them, Oliver," Thomas said, his voice regaining its strength. "We saw what they did wrong. We don't bargain with our family. We don't hide our hearts. If the weaver needs a sacrifice, she gets the truth, not a trinket." Nellie stood up, her gray dress swirling despite the lack of wind. "The hunter is very close now," she warned. "He has tasted the Sterling family, and he is hungry for a new pattern. To cross the bridge and return to the world of the sun, you must leave behind the one memory that keeps you anchored to your old, selfish selves. You must give the weaver the part of you that wanted to come to this house for the wrong reasons." This was the conflict that gripped Thomas. He had brought them to Maryland to prove he could be a provider, to satisfy his own ego after a failure in the city. He realized now that his fresh start was built on a foundation of pride. To save his family, he would have to surrender that pride. He would have to admit, fully and truly, that he was lost without them. The suspense deepened as the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to stretch and warp, the hollow man sensing the hesitation in the father's heart. The Maryland woods seemed to lean in, the ancient oaks groaning as if they were tired of holding up the sky. The silver path was thinning at the edges, the frost creeping closer to their feet. They were standing on the precipice of history, with the echoes of 1924 warning them of what happens when the heart fails its test. The choice was simple, yet devastating. Surrender the ego, or join the Sterling family as a knot in the weaver's never-ending tapestry. Thomas took a step forward, toward the glowing silver heart of the willow tree. He felt the weight of 100 years of quiet pressing against his chest. He knew that what he did next would determine if the Millers became another Maryland legend, or if they would be the ones to finally break the cycle and walk back into the light. History is a mirror, not a map. If we do not learn from the mistakes of those who came before us, their greed, their pride, their dishonesty, we are doomed to repeat their tragedies. True wisdom lies in recognizing the flaws of the past so we can build a different future. There is a silence in the deep woods of Maryland that feels like the holding of a breath before a scream. It is a heavy, pressurized quiet that settles into the marrow of your bones, making every heartbeat sound like a drum in an empty hall. As the Millers stood before the ancient, silk-draped willow, the very concept of time seemed to dissolve. The moon above didn't move, yet the shadows shifted as if dancing to a music that had no sound. This was the midnight toll, not a ringing of a bell, but a finality of the spirit. The game had reached its zenith, and the Maryland soil beneath them felt as though it were waiting to either release them or swallow them whole. Thomas stepped closer to the glowing heart of the tree, where Nellie waited with her wooden shuttle. The silver threads hanging from the branches brushed against his face, feeling like the cold, damp silk of a spider's web, yet humming with the warmth of 1,000 lived experiences. To save his family, he had to offer a sacrifice of the heart. The hunter, that elongated void of a man with limbs like charred oak, was no longer circling the perimeter. He was standing just 10 feet away, his faceless head tilted as if listening to the cracks forming in Thomas's resolve. The hunter didn't need to strike. He only needed to wait for the father to fail. "The memory," Nellie whispered, her eyes reflecting the silver glow. "Give it to the weaver, the one that anchors you to the man you used to be, the man who thought he could own the land without respecting its spirit. Give her the pride of the fresh start that was actually a flight from your own failures." Thomas closed his eyes, and a flood of memories rushed through him. He saw himself in the city, months ago, sitting in a glass office, feeling the crushing weight of a failed business venture. He saw the moment he decided to move to Maryland, not because it was right for Clara or Oliver, but because he wanted to be the king of his own small castle where no one knew his name. He had used his family as an audience for his own redemption. That pride, that desperate need to be seen as the hero who provided the perfect life, was the very thing that had made them vulnerable to the weaver's game. It was a selfish thread, and it was the one thing the hunter could grab onto. "I give it up," Thomas said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. He visualized that memory, the pride of the Thorne farmhouse purchase, the ego of the provider, and he felt it being pulled from his mind like a long, silver needle. It was painful, a spiritual tearing that left him feeling hollow and small. Behind him, Clara gasped as she saw a dark, smoky vapor leak from Thomas's forehead, swirling into the air before being snatched up by Nellie's wooden shuttle. The moment the sacrifice was accepted, the Maryland woods exploded into a symphony of light. The silver threads on the willow tree turned from white to a brilliant, burning gold. The hunter let out a sound that tore through the air, a screech like metal grinding on stone, and began to wither. The void that made up his body started to unravel, the charred limbs turning into actual dead wood that fell harmlessly to the frost-covered grass. Without the anchor of Thomas's secret pride, the predator had no purchase on their reality. The monster was a reflection of the family's own internal shadows, and with the truth laid bare, the shadow had nowhere to hide. But the resolution was only partial. The vanishing room of the house hadn't reappeared, and the path ahead didn't lead back to the road. Instead, the golden threads began to weave themselves into a bridge that stretched over a massive, yawning chasm that hadn't been there a moment before. The chasm was filled with the gray mist of 1924, and from its depths, the voices of the Sterling family called out, a haunting chorus of those who had failed the toll. "You must cross," Nellie commanded, her form beginning to fade as the sun, a real Maryland sunrise, started to bleed over the horizon. The weaver has her memory. She has her pattern. But the bridge only stays whole as long as you do not look back. If you look at what you have lost, the threads will snap, and you will join the Sterlings in the quiet. Thomas grabbed Clara's hand, and Clara grabbed Oliver's. They stepped onto the golden bridge. It felt like walking on air, a terrifyingly thin ribbon of light suspended over an abyss of Maryland history. The wind howled around them, carrying the scents of 100 years, tobacco, coal smoke, old parchment, and the salt of the Chesapeake. The voices in the mist grew louder, calling their names, mimicking the sound of friends and neighbors from the life they had left behind. "Don't look, Oliver," Clara whispered, her eyes locked on the back of Thomas's head. "Look at me, only at me." They moved with a desperate, rhythmic pace. Thump-a-h-h, thump-a-h-h, their footsteps echoing the sound of the weaver's loom. The suspense was a physical weight. Every inch of Thomas's body wanted to turn around to see if the farmhouse was still there, to see if the life he had built was truly gone forever. But he knew that the game was about moving forward, not clinging to a past that had already been woven into someone else's tapestry. As they reached the midpoint of the bridge, the golden threads began to vibrate. The midnight toll was ending, and the bridge was starting to dissolve behind them. They could hear the snapping of the silk, a sound like pistol shots in the quiet morning air. The abyss below seemed to reach up with fingers of mist, trying to snag their heels. The Maryland they knew was so close. They could see the red-winged blackbirds starting to fly, and they could smell the morning coffee of a world that didn't know about the weaver. With one final, lung-bursting sprint, the Millers leapt from the end of the dissolving bridge. They tumbled onto a patch of dirt, feeling the familiar, humid warmth of a Maryland summer morning. The frost was gone. The silver threads were gone. They were lying in the middle of an overgrown field, half a mile from where the Thorne farmhouse should have been. They stood up, shaking and covered in dew. When they turned back to look for the house, there was nothing but a clearing filled with ancient, gnarled oak trees and a single rotting foundation stone. The house hadn't just vanished. It felt as though it had never been there at all. They were safe, they were together, and they were alive. But as Thomas reached into his pocket, his fingers brushed against something hard and cold. He pulled it out. It was a small wooden figurine of a bird, the very first piece of the game. It wasn't silver, and it wasn't glowing. It was just an old piece of Maryland folk art. But as he looked at it, he noticed a new carving on the bird's wing. 3 tiny figures holding hands, etched into the wood with a precision that no human hand could achieve. The game was over, but the quiet had left its mark. They had survived the weaver, but they had learned that some things, once vanished, can never be truly found again. True sacrifice is not about giving up something you own, but giving up who you think you are for the ones you love. To find your way out of the darkness, you must be willing to let go of the pride that put you there in the first place. Bravery is the act of stepping onto the bridge of the future without looking back at the ruins of the past. The sun that rose over the Maryland hills that morning was not the sickly, pale orb of the weaver's realm. It was a fierce, radiant gold that burned through the lingering mists of the Chesapeake, casting long, warm shadows across the overgrown meadow. Thomas, Clara, and Oliver stood huddled together in the tall grass, their clothes torn and damp with dew, their skin tingling with the sudden return of the summer humidity. The silence was gone. In its place was the chaotic, beautiful symphony of the living world. The frantic buzzing of dragonflies, the distant caw of a crow, and the rhythmic, steady thud of a woodpecker in the nearby oaks. It was the sound of reality, yet to the Millers, it felt like a foreign language they were only just beginning to relearn. They stood where the Thorne farmhouse should have been, but there was no white timber, no wraparound porch, and no attic where a hidden box waited to be found. Instead, there was only a rectangular depression in the earth, overgrown with wild blackberries and Queen Anne's lace. A few charred, moss-covered stones marked the corners of a foundation that looked like it had been reclaimed by the forest a century ago. It was as if the house had been a ghost itself, a structural memory that had only solidified long enough to catch its next players. Thomas looked at the wooden bird in his hand, the only physical proof that the last 48 hours hadn't been a shared fever dream. The carvings of the three of them were still there, a tiny, silent testament to their survival. "We have to walk to the road," Thomas said, his voice sounding thin and raspy in the vastness of the morning. He didn't look back at the foundation. He didn't want to see if a silver thread was still anchored to the stones. He took Clara's hand, and they began to navigate the thicket, heading toward the gravel path where they had once parked their moving truck. As they walked, the Maryland woods felt different. Not hostile, but indifferent. The trees were just trees again. The shadows were just absence of light. But the family walked with a new kind of awareness, a realization that the world has thin places, where the past and the present are stitched together with very fragile thread. When they finally reached the main road, the sight of a passing car, a dusty blue sedan, brought a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought Clara to her knees. The driver, an elderly man with a face like a wrinkled map of the county, pulled over and stared at them with wide, disbelieving eyes. He was the same man from the general store who had stopped rocking his chair when Thomas first mentioned the Thorne property. He didn't ask them what happened. He didn't ask why they were covered in dirt and silk. He simply opened the back door of his car and gestured for them to get in. "You're the ones," the old man said quietly as they drove toward the town. "The family that bought the full house. We figured you'd be gone by now. Most folk who go up that driveway don't come back the same way they went in. Some don't come back at all." He looked at Oliver through the rearview mirror, his gaze lingering on the boy's pale face. The sterling boy. He would have been about your age. That was a long time ago. Folks around here stopped playing that game before I was born. But the woods have a long memory. They didn't go back to the town to reclaim their belongings, for they realized they had nothing left to reclaim. Their furniture, their clothes, their old photographs. Everything had vanished with the house, woven into the weaver's tapestry to pay for the path they had walked. They were a family with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the truth in their hearts. When they reached the local diner, the townspeople watched them through the windows with a mixture of awe and pity. They were the quiet family who hadn't stayed quiet. They were the ones who had played the game once and returned to tell the tale, even if the tale was one that no one wanted to hear. As the days passed and the Millers relocated to a small, sun-drenched apartment in a bustling part of Annapolis, the memories of the weaver began to soften at the edges, like an old photograph left in the sun. Thomas found a job not as a high-stakes executive, but as a carpenter, working with his hands to build things that were meant to last. Clara began to paint, her canvases filled with vibrant Maryland landscapes that were always bathed in light, never in shadow. They lived a simple life, a quiet life in the best sense of the word. They had learned that the greatest treasures weren't the things they could own, but the moments they could share. Oliver, however, remained the most changed. Sometimes, on humid nights when the Maryland mists rolled in from the bay, he would sit by the window and stare out into the dark. He didn't talk to Nellie anymore, but he would occasionally hum a melody that sounded like the vibration of silver threads. One evening, Thomas found him holding the wooden bird, tracing the carvings of the family with his thumb. Oliver looked up at his father, his eyes bright with a wisdom that no 7-year-old should possess. "Dad," Oliver whispered, "does the weaver ever get lonely? Now that the house is gone and the game is finished." Thomas sat down beside his son and put an arm around his shoulders. "I think the weaver is part of the land, Oliver. She isn't lonely. She's just waiting. She keeps the balance. And as long as people respect the woods and stay together, she doesn't need to spin any new paths." He took the wooden bird and placed it on the windowsill, where the moonlight caught the grain of the wood. "We won the game, buddy. We get to live in the light now." The story of the Miller family became one of those Maryland legends whispered around campfires and in the back corners of rural bars. Some say they didn't really escape, that they are still walking that golden bridge, and the people in Annapolis are just shadows the weaver sent back to keep the town from asking too many questions. But those who saw the Millers know the truth. They saw the way Thomas looked at his wife, the way Clara held her son, and the way they all avoided the color silver and the sound of ringing bells. They were a family that had been through the fire and the frost, and they had come out stronger for it. The Maryland woods remain, vast and ancient, stretching from the mountains to the sea. And somewhere, in a clearing where blackberries grow over a forgotten foundation, a single silver thread might still be seen, shimmering in the moonlight. It is a reminder that the folklore of America is not just in books. It is in the soil, in the trees, and in the choices we make when we think no one is watching. The quiet Maryland family didn't vanish. They simply found a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes after the storm, when the heart is finally at peace. The greatest treasures in life are not the houses we build or the things we accumulate, but the lives we lead in the light of truth and love. To survive the darkness of the world, we must be willing to let go of our pride and hold onto each other. The path home is always open to those who walk it with a brave and honest heart.